Dr. Watson A. Bose of the University of Colorado Medical School has stated, "The beginning of a single human life is, from a biological point of view, a simple and straightforward matter. The beginning is conception. This straightforward biological fact should not be distorted to serve sociological, political, or economic goals." So this is not a speech about religion or abortion. I just began researching speeches to give this week, and I really loved reading about this, and that's why I wanted to present what I had learned. Most of us probably already have a stance on this topic one way or the other, and I understand that. I'm just here to give you the scientific evidence that I found looking in medical journals, professional medical organization websites, and educational government sites. So today, we are going to look at the history of science's understanding of conception. What is a human being, and is that the same as human life? And then some common assumptions people have. So first, let's start at the beginning. We're not going to do the beginning of creation. That's a whole different speech. But we are going to look at the beginning of modern day research. It started for conception. So it started in the late 1800s. There was a Swiss man named Wilhelm His. Wilhelm His produced a series of slides from 8.5 weeks to 15 weeks. They were hand-drawn slides of human embryos developing in the uterus, and they were very accurate. They were used in many textbooks for many, many years. Then we have a German man named Franz Kybel. Kybel, in the early 1900s, established a series of 16 volumes of books. They were the divisions of human development. This became the first standard, and it's important because it stated that there were consistent patterns of development in utero, and these are universal patterns. So things develop at the same time for every human being. So up until the mid-20th century, we had very few images. Most of them were hand-drawn. A lot of them, even through the 50s and 60s, were still from Wilhelm His. They were still very accurate, even by today's standards, though. But then, 1978, we saw the birth of in vitro fertilization. Now, IVF makes it possible to study fertilization as it's actually happening. So with this greater clarity of developmental stages, then they clarified the terms. Our third clarification of terms since that first book by Kybel was called the Terminologia Embryologica. They started updating terms, and they began working on this book. They worked through the 90s, and it was published in 2013. So if you took classes in middle school or high school for human development, you might have remembered learning that in utero, babies had gills. And I remember learning this. It stood out for me because I thought, how cool, gills. Could you ever be born with gills and you could swim underwater and breathe underwater? No. People do not have gills, and so this book helped clarify a lot of misconceptions like that. We actually have pharyngeal arches, and these pharyngeal arches will later develop into your facial structure, parts of your facial structure. So, sorry, nobody can ever be born able to breathe underwater. This brings us to our modern day and a quick look at distinguishing cells. When scientists are looking at cells, they have two criteria for distinguishing one type from another. We have what a cell is made of, and we have how the cell behaves. So we also want to take a look at our chromosomes. Every cell in the human body consists of 22 sets of 23 chromosomes, and we have 46 in every cell in the human body. So cells are different from organisms because cells are a part of a living being, and an organism is a living being able to direct and operate independently. Important side note is that cells that operate independently are actually malformed, and that's where we get tumors and cancers. So we can see a very clear difference between cells and organisms. Now that we're caught up to date and we can distinguish cells, we need to clarify what a human being is. So human being versus human life. They both sound kind of like the same thing, but there's a very big difference when we're talking about conception. At conception, We have a single sperm and a single egg, each with 23 chromosomes. They come together to form a new single-celled organism that's called a zygote. The zygote now has 46 chromosomes. So why is this zygote an organism and not just another cell? Diane N. Irving, MA and PhD at Princeton University, describes a zygote in this way. She says it's an organism with 46 chromosomes, the number required of a member of the human species. This human being immediately produces specifically human proteins and enzymes, directs his or her own future growth and development as a human, and is a new, genetically unique, newly existing, live human individual. So as Diane stated in her quote, we can see that the zygote forms into an embryo and directs his or her own development independent from her mother. This organized, coordinated behavior of the embryo is the defining characteristic of a human organism, according to Maureen Kondak, PhD. Maureen Kondak is the Associate Professor of Neurobiology and Adjunct Professor of Pediatrics at the University of School of Medicine. And then I have another quote here from Professor Jaime Gordon from the Mayo Clinic. By all the criteria of modern molecular biology, life is present from the moment of conception. So knowing these facts, that a human being has 46 chromosomes, develops independently, is genetically unique, and directing their own future growth, what are some common assumptions that people still hold? So our first common assumption that we're going to look at is that people believe that human embryos are life in the same way human sperm and egg are life. They're blobs of cells with the potential for human life. Well, as we already looked at, sperms and eggs cannot develop the way an embryo can develop. They only have 23 chromosomes. They are not independent organs. They are cells. The zygote has a potential to become a person the same way a boy has the potential to grow to be a man. Something could go wrong and the boy never grows to be a man, but that doesn't mean that he's not a person. So Dr. Alfred M. Bongiovanni, Professor of Pediatrics and Obstetrics at the University of Pennsylvania, says it this way: I am no more prepared to say that these early stages of development in the womb represent an incomplete human being than I would be to say that a child prior to the dramatic effects of puberty is not a human being. This is human life at every stage. So they are not just a blob of cells. These are working independently. They're an organism that is developing on time. And that leads us to another common assumption people have, is that the embryo is not a person because they don't look like a person. Well, genetically, he or she is a human and looks exactly the way that they're supposed to look at that point in development. That was the whole importance of setting those developmental stages with those books, is to show that we each have those stages, those milestones to hit as developing human beings. And that just because you haven't formed hands yet does not mean you're not a person and you won't form those hands. And if in some rare cases people never form hands or arms, that does not make them less of a person. They just didn't hit that developmental stage. It isn't even a boy or girl. Okay, I'm going to take you back again to science, in high school science class. Remember that we have dad's sperm. You've either got two X's and they're a girl, or they've got an XY and they're a boy. So at the moment of fertilization, sex is determined immediately by that individual sperm. They might as well be pink and blue swimming around in there because it's that definitive. And our last common assumption is that without the formation of a brain or the ability to think, it's not a person. So this question is actually stepping away from scientific evidence and into philosophical speculation. We see that the human brain continues to develop sentience into adulthood. Why do you think that you can't rent a car until you're 25 years old? I'm sure there's a lot of scientific evidence backing up the fact that sentience is not fully developed, and those car companies want to be careful about how mature their drivers are. So what can we conclude from all of this information? Human beings are created at conception. They don't gain that status by some arbitrary date someone somewhere created. The history of conception has gone through rapid growth in the last 140 years. As science has progressed, a clear distinction can be made between human life and a human being able to direct its own development. Common assumptions still exist, though, because they're often relying on outdated information. My hope is that if you still have questions about when human life begins, you'll take the time to investigate for yourself. I'll leave you with one final quote from Dr. Jérôme Lejeune, professor of genetics at the University of Descartes in Paris. He is the discoverer of the chromosome pattern for Down syndrome. He says, after fertilization has taken place, a new human being has come into being. This is no longer a matter of taste or opinion and not a metaphysical contention. It is plain experimental evidence. Each individual has a very neat beginning at conception.